Undertaker's Moon by Ronald Kelly. Excerpt read by Wayne June. The hour was late when Patrick O'Shea called it a night and left the good fellowship and crackling hearth of Keenan's pub. He had spent the evening as he customarily did, partaking of several rounds of dark ale and a game or two of darts between lively discussion about local politics and town gossip. But eventually, the potency of the strong drink and the knowledge that his wife was probably worrying herself sick over his whereabouts pried Patrick from the midst of the boisterous crowd. He wished his mates a good night, donned his hat, coat, and muffler, and then stepped into the bracing chill of the November darkness. The little village of Kanturk, located in the heart of County Cork, Ireland, was deserted and quiet at that twilight hour. Patrick pulled his pocket watch from his fob and consulted the time. The ornate hands were edging toward the stroke of midnight. "The wife will surely have me hide for this," he breathed, returning the watch and chain to his vest. He had assured dear Mary that he would be home by 11 o'clock or half-past at the very least, but a hearty argument over the pros and cons of Britain's occupation of Northern Ireland had driven the immediacy of domestic promises completely from his mind. He took his bicycle from where it leaned against the gray-stoned wall of the public house and, climbing upon the frame, propelled himself southward down the empty street, his lanky legs pumping the pedals. Soon he had left the darkened shops of Kanturk behind, including that of his own business, and began the 2-mile journey home. A full moon hung against the starry sky overhead. It cast a pale glow upon the grassy meadows of the rolling Irish countryside. If it had been spring of the year, Patrick would have found enjoyment in the picturesque scene. But the impact of its ghostly beauty was dampened by the bite of a cold northern wind blowing up the length of his spine. He shuddered and, gathering his woolen coat and plaid scarf closer about him, hunkered over the cycle, making himself less of a target for the merciless breeze. It was on frigid nights such as these that he longed for the convenience of an automobile. Patrick O'Shea was the only practicing mortician in the town of Kanturk, and although some of the populace still leaned toward traditional wakes and family funerals, he did a brisk and respectable business. Still, his finances were tight, and it would be quite a while before he allowed himself the luxury of a motor car. He took a sharp bend in the road and passed the lofty structure of the Catholic rectory and the cemetery beyond, the latter enclosed by a high fence of wrought iron. As he sped past, Patrick peered through the rows of age-mottled stones, searching for the location of the day's work. He spotted the mound of newly turned earth within the shadows of a gnarled black oak. The man that lay beneath 6 feet of Irish sod was an unfortunate soul by the name of Hugh McLaughlin. Hugh had been generally known for his aversion to work and his frequent binges at Keenan's pub. As a matter of fact, whiskey had proven to be McLaughlin's downfall, for the influence of the liquor had clouded the man's senses on his walk home the night before and caused him to stumble into the path of a northbound train to Limerick. All the money old Hugh had in the world had been found in his pockets and had barely covered the cost of his coffin and burial. There had been no allowance for the modern services of embalming and cosmetology, which would have been absolutely pointless in the undertaker's opinion. The locomotive had done a nasty job on poor Hugh. It had twisted and battered the drunkard beyond recognition, and any amount of preservation or reconstruction on Patrick's part would have been an exercise in futility. Patrick drove the thoughts of death from his mind as he headed along a lonely country road bordered by low walls of heaped stone. Instead, he considered the family that awaited him at home. No more than 5 brief years had passed since his marriage to sweet Mary, but already the good Lord had blessed him with 2 fine children. The boy, Devon, was nearly 2 years old, bearing the dark hair and eyes of his father's black Irish heritage. The infant girl, Rosie, who had first breathed life in the spring of that year, possessed the fiery red hair of her saintly mother. Minutes later, the final stretch of his nocturnal journey came to an end. He slowed to a halt in front of the modest cottage he called home and opened the wooden gate, guiding his bike into the small garden. The flower beds were shriveled and brown with the coming of winter, but he could still picture them as they had been a few short months ago, brilliant with budding roses, marigold, and purple iris. He was strolling up the stone walkway, digging through his pockets for his key, when he tripped over something near the front stoop. He was surprised to find a carpet-bag sitting there, with a long blackthorn cane, a shillelagh, leaning across the satchel's handle. Patrick was puzzled by the presence of the traveling gear, especially since it was left unattended in the center of his front walk. Then he looked toward the doorway, and his confusion turned into alarm. The heavy oaken door yawned open before him, the foyer beyond cloaked in shadow, dark and devoid of inner light. Even if Mary had gone to bed early, she would have left a fire burning in the kitchen hearth. But as he stepped warily into the house, he was welcomed only by cool darkness. Glancing into the broad kitchen, he saw that the fireplace was black and empty, nary an ember glowing in its sooty hollow. Patrick opened his mouth to call out, but a faint sound from the rear of the cottage caused the words to freeze in his throat. It was a low, guttural sound, much like the throaty growl of a mastiff. He stepped into the kitchen, walked to the hearth, and took a double-barreled shotgun from the rack overhead. He checked the quail gun, found 2 loads in the twin portals, then quietly closed the breech. With a heavy stone of dread nestled in the pit of his gut, Patrick O'Shea made his way down the center hallway. The first room he came to was that of his children. He found the door ajar. Standing perfectly still, he listened for the soft breathing of their slumber, but heard nothing after a moment of maddening silence. Steeling himself for the worst, he stepped into the room and flicked on the light switch. The first thing that assaulted his senses was the amount of blood that covered the walls of the room. It looked as if the refuse from some hellish slaughterhouse had been splashed upon the wallpaper and the sturdy beams of the low ceiling. Then he looked toward the bed of his son and felt the bile of a night's drinking begin to rise into his throat. Little Devon lay sprawled upon the floor beside his bed. His pajamas, as well as the youthful flesh underneath, had been torn to shreds. The child's back had been ripped open. Amid the raw crimson of the open wound, Patrick could see the stark white bones of his exposed spine. The man turned his eyes away, directed his panicked gaze to the wooden crib, but the sight awaiting him there was even more terrifying. Rivulets of blood dripped down the pickets of the baby bed. Within that gruesome cage he could see something lying upon the gory linen, something tiny and twisted and torn. Above the crushed head of his infant daughter hung the mobile of dancing fairies and leprechauns that Patrick had carved on the eve of her birth. They bobbed and capered on their taut strings, blood-freckled faces eternally gleeful, despite the savage slaughter below their feet. Patrick groaned and stumbled back out into the hallway. He slumped to his knees, gagging, ready to void himself of 4 pints of pub ale. But something made him swallow his sickness. That low, rumbling growl tremored through the darkness. from the direction of his own bedroom. His heart pounded in his chest, and although he wanted to flee that lonely cottage in fear, he knew that he must check the back room. It was possible that his wife had not suffered the same fate as his Devon and Rosie. Perhaps there was still time to save her from the barbarity that had rent his children's flesh and broken their bones. He struggled to his feet and walked to the open doorway of his bedroom, the weapon clutched tightly in his hands. When he finally reached the dark room, he did not even bother to turn on the light. He knew at once that the dregs of disaster occupied that place also. He could smell the coppery scent of blood in the air, and, by the glow of a moonlit window, could see the ugly carnage that had once been his wife. Patrick staggered to the foot of the four-poster bed, and a low moan rose in his throat as he stared at the body of his beloved Mary. She lay spread-eagle across the feather mattress. Her white nightgown had been ripped open, as had her rib cage. Patrick's moan built in intensity, blossoming into a shriek of crazed anguish as he looked into the glistening pit of his wife's open torso, laying witness to the shattered bones of her ribs and the shredded tissue of her heart and lungs. His wail of torment choked off into shocked silence when he raised his tearful gaze to her bloodless face and watched in bewilderment as her eyelids flickered, then opened. He expected to see the glassy glaze of death that he was so very familiar with, but instead her emerald eyes blazed with renewed life. "Patrick," she whispered softly, extending a pale hand toward him. He began to back away, shaking his head in disbelief. He watched as her mutilated body went through a strange rejuvenation. The mauled tissues of her internal organs began to knit together and heal of their own accord. The jagged flats of the ribcage also mended, once again joining the shattered breastbone. Finally, the creamy flesh of her chest crept inward like a converging tide, sealing away the inner workings of her anatomy. Patrick could bear to look no more. He turned his face to the far corner of the room and saw a pair of eyes blazing at him from within the dense shadows. They were the size of shot glasses and as icy blue as moonlight on a winter snow. Patrick felt cold fear creep through the very marrow of his bones as the throaty growl came again, and with it the fetid warmth of bestial breath on his face. He caught the odor of blood and decayed meat, as well as the musky scent of the animal that crouched in the darkness before him. Patrick took a step backward as the beast moved stealthily toward him. He suddenly remembered the shotgun and lifted the stock to his shoulder. He squeezed both triggers, sending a bee-swarm of buckshot at the center of the hulking monstrosity. The beast grunted at the impact of the blast, but it did not slow its swift advance. With an ear-splitting roar, the intruder leapt from the shadows, and Patrick received a fleeting glimpse of the horror that confronted him. In the pale wash of moonlight, he saw an enormous wolf coming for him. Or rather, it was a nightmarish hybrid of wolf and man. It towered over him, its long ears brushing the beams of the ceiling, and its coat of bristly gray fur gleaming like silver upon its head and shoulders. A hairy arm of incredible length lashed out at him, and before he could react, Patrick felt its razored claws bite deeply into his midsection. He glanced down to see his belly slashed open and his entrails hanging precariously within the gaping wound on the verge of uncoiling. The horrid sight of his own evisceration was blocked by the looming presence of his attacker, and abruptly he found himself pressed with his back to the hardwood floor, struggling beneath a hirsute knot of hellish fury. He kicked and thrashed and prayed to the Lord Almighty to save him from this savage fiend, But his pleas went unheeded. Patrick stared up into a wolfish face and watched as it leered mercilessly down at him, black lips peeling back to reveal yellowed fangs. Hot saliva dripped upon the column of his bare throat, telegraphing the monster's brutal intentions. The Undertaker of the town of Kanturk threw back his head and prepared to scream, but suddenly he had nothing to scream with. The sharp mass of ivory fangs yawned wide and dipped, sinking deeply into the tender flesh of his gullet and ripping his throat open as unconsciousness overcame him. Patrick O'Shea awoke to find himself staring at the pale sphere of the moon. Puzzled, he regarded it for a moment, for it had shifted its position since the last time he saw it. From where it hung in the dark November sky, he guessed that a couple of hours had passed since the time of his death. Abruptly he sat up and found himself in the middle of the Kanturk cemetery. In fact, he was perched atop the earthen mound of the very grave he had dug and filled that afternoon. He glanced at the head of the grave and saw someone standing with his back to the oak. The man was tall and elderly, dressed in a suit of fine black cloth. His features were angular and hearty in color, topped by a thick mane of silvery hair. He held a knotty blackthorn cane in his hands, the nimble fingers caressing the shillelagh like some men would caress the breast of a woman. Patrick saw his family standing a few feet away, amid a cluster of stained tombstones. Mary held the infant Rosie in the crook of her arm, while the other arm hugged little Devon close to her side. Their nightclothes were torn and bloody, but their fatal wounds seemed to be strangely absent. Patrick stared down at his own torn clothing. The flesh of his abdomen was no longer raw, ripped, and bleeding. The organs no longer exposed. In place of the damage was a thick patch of scar tissue, pale pink and tender to the touch. He raised a trembling hand to his throat and found the skin there to be intact also. The mortician again turned his eyes toward the elderly man beneath the tree. There was now a long-handled spade in his hands. With a downward thrust he buried the blade of the shovel into the dank earth of Hugh McLaughlin's grave. Pale blue eyes gleamed from dark pits beneath the man's bushy brows. "Dig," he commanded. Patrick could voice no protest as he stared into the eyes of the stranger and caught an unnerving glimpse of the silver-haired beast hiding beneath the severity of his icy gaze. He stood and, grasping the wooden handle of the shovel, did as he was told. Time and time again, the edge of the spade bit into raw earth, and inch by inch the dirt was displayed and tossed to the side. When he had gotten 3 feet from his objective, Patrick felt a peculiar sensation grip him. His stomach began to burn, not with pain, but with a nagging emptiness, an emptiness that yearned to be filled. Also, his muscles began to bunch and spasm, as if they had broken the slavery of his brain and taken on a life of their own. His flesh grew hot and prickly, as though sharp needles surged beneath the surface, attempting to force themselves through the pores of his skin, and his bones throbbed in dull agony. They actually felt as though they were stretching and bending beyond the limits of his skeletal system, striving to become something other than that of a normal human being. He glanced up out of the open grave and saw that the elderly gentleman had disrobed. He crouched at the foot of the oak tree, doubled over, head in his hands as if in the throes of some horrid suffering. The stranger's back bowed, and his spine stretched tautly through his skin, popping with gunshot cracks as it broadened and elongated. Patrick cast a quick glance at his family and saw that they, too, had cast their gory garments aside. Naked they writhed among the tombstones, their bodies contorting, growing slick with sweat, then dense with sprouting hair. Abruptly, a feeling of madness gripped the Undertaker. He flung the shovel away and began to tear at his own clothing, for the very touch of the material seemed to sear his flesh like fire. Soon he was also naked and caught in the grip of internal conflict. "Dig," the stranger snarled hoarsely. "Dig, damn you!" His flesh was alive with a thickening mat of silvery fur, and his face contorted horribly. Patrick could hear the bones of his skull cracking and reshaping beneath the flesh as the nose and mouth protruded in an obscene image of a leering canine. Patrick no longer needed to be told, for the prize beneath the remaining yard of earth seemed to be the most important thing of his entire existence. He began to dig with his bare hands, even as the change racked his body with torment. He watched as his frantic arms transformed, the muscles writhed and lengthened. Tufts of coarse black hair sprouted from his filthy skin like clover from fertile ground. His fingers grew long and the nails incredibly sharp, providing tools that put the simple spade to shame. The yearning in his stomach reached its pinnacle as his ebony hands scooped away the last of the dirt, and his claws scraped against the grain of the casket lid. He now knew that what he felt was hunger, a hunger unlike any he had ever known before. And as he thrust his fists through the thin barrier of pine wood and sank wrist-deep into the rotting mass of the deceased drunkard, he realized the unholy nature of his bestial craving. As he and the others ate with the abandon of starved wolves, Patrick O'Shea prayed to God that his horrible nightmare would soon come to an end. Unfortunately, his plea for heavenly deliverance fell on deaf ears. Captive to the ravenous turmoil within, he lowered his fanged head and continued to feast upon the flesh of the unliving.